Chapter 30, Section 3 of J.B. Bury's The Students' Roman Empire, Part 2. Recording by Chris Caron. The Students' Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 30. The Roman World under the Empire, Politics, Philosophy, Religion, and Art, Section 3. Religion. It would be a great mistake to suppose that skepticism and disbelief in the national religion, which were prevalent enough among the educated classes in the first century A.D., had made any way among the uneducated masses. The great majority of the people of the empire believed as firmly as their ancestors in the existence of the gods. Evidence of this fact must be sought, not so much in literature, which is misleading because it represents the opinions of cultivated society, as in inscriptions, which directly reflect popular beliefs. Besides the abundant evidence of inscriptions, there are three considerations which show the strength of the old religion. Its vitality is proved by its power of assimilating elements from Oriental creeds, by the creation of new deities, such as Antoinine, the goddess of the corn market, the deification of emperors both living and dead, the multiplication of the genii, by the resistance which it offered to Christianity for nearly 500 years, and by the remarkable fact that the early Christians themselves never thought of disbelieving in the existence of the pagan gods, whom they regarded as really existing powers of darkness. In regard to the rebellious attitude of educated people, there was a notable difference between the first and second centuries. In the first century, men who read and reflected, but did not embrace any definite philosophical system, wavered between polytheism and monotheism. Tacitus seems to have believed in the gods. Quintilian veered towards monotheism, but does not seem to have absolutely rejected polytheism, or summed to any clear conclusion. Pliny the Elder definitely denied the existence of the gods, and identified God with nature. He held especially that God is not omnipotent, for he cannot kill himself, or make immortal what is mortal, or undo the past, or make twice 10 anything but 20. Some of the Stoics, as we have seen, made a systematic attempt to reconcile their received religion with enlightened thought. They believed in one supreme God, but set under him a number of gods of lower rank, whom they called demons, and with whom the popular gods could be identified. But these streams of doubt and disbelief did not affect the masses. In the second century we became aware of a great reaction. There was a general return on the part of educated men to the old religion. Superstition prevailed, and miracle-mongering became the fashion. This change is clearly reflected in the literature of the Ion. Even the younger Pliny, whose philosophic beliefs approximated to Stoicism, believed firmly in dreams, and built 2 temples. Suinus was childishly superstitious. During an illness of Faustina, Pronto prayed to the god for her health every morning. Augustus was extremely conservative in matters of religion. Turning to Greek literature, we meet the same phenomenon. Cruelty is one of its distinguishing notes. Lucian and Gallian are the 2 exceptions. Plutarch is deeply religious. Pausanias is absurdly superstitious. The cruelty of Aristides, the rhetorician, rises to enthusiasm. It is necessary to be fully aware of this widespread superstition, in order to appreciate the satirical wit of Lucian. The prevalence of superstition is illustrated by the story, which the sophist Philostratus composed, early in the 3rd century, of the wonder-worker Apollonius of Tyana, who, having travelled in throughout the whole world, having learned wisdom from the Brahmins of India, and mystic lore from the priests of Egypt, suddenly appeared in Greek lands of the reign of Claudius, wrought miraculous cures, raised the dead, walked through shut doors, rendered himself invisible at pleasure, and performed all kinds of miracles. It is not to be regarded as sober history. It is merely a romance, but the picture which it draws of the general cruelty is probably true to life. Astrology was encouraged, both by the higher and lower classes. Noble houses often kept private astrologers, mathematici, to consult about future events. At these seers were subjected of revealing the succession to the principate, and were consulted in the case of treasonable conspiracies. The emperors regarded them with superstition, and edicts were issued again and again, banishing them from Italy, but it is proved impossible to suppress them. The emperors, however widely their policies differed in other respects, were all alike solicitous to maintain the religion of the Roman Republic, as became the high pontiffs. Augustus had perceived that the close connection of the Principate with religion, recognized as a political tradition by his successors, the higher classes at Rome, the Senate and the knights, were ready to follow the example of the emperors, and were glad to distinguish themselves from freedmen and foreigners by clinging to the ceremonials of the old Roman religion. The national worship, however, was not held incompatible with foreign cults, which, owing to the increased communication between the East and West, rapidly made their way into me, and the worship of Isis in particular, and so securely established itself that she seemed almost to hold a place in the Roman Olympus. "We have received Isis," says a poet, Nero's age, "into Roman temples." Besides the criticism of philosophy, there were at work other forces hostile to the pagan religion. These were the two rival religions, Judaism and Christianity. Being both monotheistic, they were both alike diametrically opposed to polytheism. The chief Jewish doctrines spread with the Jewish diaspora on the west as well as the east, and commanded attention. Popularly, indeed, the Jews were regarded with the greatest contempt. Their poverty, their dirty habits, their curious customs, such as circumcision, abstinence from pork, and keeping of the Sabbath, were a constant theme for ridicule. Yet Judaism possessed attraction, especially for women. The Jews were ready to compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and though their efforts in this direction were never attended with such results as the preaching of Christianity, they were not altogether unsuccessful. Poppaea, the wife of Nero, was a convert to Judaism. Under Tiberius, Fulvia, a lady of high rank, adopted the Jewish faith, and sent gifts to the temple at Jerusalem. It is said that the banishment of the Jews from Rome by Tiberius was caused by the complaints of her husband. Horace, to get rid of his bore, affected respect for the 13th Sabbath. Augustus praised his grandson Gaius for having passed through Jordan without worshipping in Jerusalem. In the meantime, Christianity was silently spreading in the West as well as in the East. The causes which chiefly promoted its rapid diffusion were its all-embracing character. It opened its fold to sinners and slaves, the attraction which it possessed for women who felt themselves placed on a spiritual equality with men, the promise of a future life. When persecution began, the examples of noble martyrdom produced their effect. In order to contend successfully with heresies, which were rife, especially with Gnosticism, the orthodox majority were forced to form a close organization, which soon came to be called the Catholic Church. This organization, this state within the state, was ultimately destined to exercise a decisive influence on the empire. But it attracted little notice in the 2nd century, for Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius, as well as for Trajan and Hadrian. The Christian question was of quite minor importance. We have seen that Christianity was a prohibited religion. This principle had probably been laid down by Domitian, and was affirmed by Trajan in his rescript to Pliny. But the actual practice of emperors varied. Trajan did not discourage informations against Christians, but forbade his officials to seek them out. Hadrian tolerated this religion, and there is no evidence that Christians suffered during his principate. Under Antoninus, the same practice seems to have been followed as under Trajan. Thus several Christians at Rome, who confessed their faith before Lollius Urbicu, prefect of the city, were condemned. Antoninus, although more sincerely devoted to the established religion than any other emperor, was mild and tolerant, and disliked persecution, and towards the end of his reign, at least, he interfered to prevent it. His interference was called forth by the occurrence of tumults, directed against the Christians in cities of Asia and Greece, for at this time the feeling of hostility against the Christians was very bitter. They were believed, even by such a well-informed person as Fronto, to practice horrible enormities. The 3 charges popularity brought against them were sacrilege, incest, and cannibalism. It is remarkable, however, that the government seems to have paid no attention to the 2nd and 3rd charges. Evidence of the prevailing prejudice against Christianity is found in the writings of Lucian and of the rhetorician Aristides. A little later, Celsius wrote a treatise, entitled The True Word, to prove the absurdity of the prohibited religion. In consequence of the hostile feeling, popular tumults often broke out in the cities of the East, where the people were enthusiastically devoted to the divine worship of the empire. The mob cried for vengeance on the Christians. Many of the Christians were themselves eager for martyrdom, and the official authorities could not protect men who were shown, by their own confession, to be guilty of sacrilegum. Thus the Christians were practically exposed to a persecution which was not organized or ordained by the authorities, but which the authorities, if they maintained the law, could not put a stop to without the special intervention of the emperor. Antoninus intervened and set rescripts to Thessalonica, Athens, and other cities, to prevent these persecutions. A letter purporting to have been written by him to the Provincial Council of Asia is extant, and though it is a forged document, the very fact of its forgery proves the reputation for toleration and clemency which he enjoyed among the Christians. They looked upon Antoninus as not only tolerant, but even favorable to their creed. Under Marcus, popular tumults were frequent. It was in a tumult of this kind that Bishop Polycarp of Smyrna suffered martyrdom. Marcus Aurelius, like Antoninus, was of a tolerant disposition, but his strict sense of duty led him into countenancing persecution. He regarded the resoluteness of the Christians in refusing to take part in the worship of the gods as sheer obstinacy. About 177 A.D., he issued a rescript providing for the punishment of new sects, which caused popular tumults by spreading doctrines by which the ill-balanced minds of men are excited. This was not directed specifically against Christianity, but it led to an outbreak at Legundum, and the arrest of a number of Christians. The legatus of Legundaitis did not feel sure how he ought to deal with his prisoners, especially with those who denied the faith, and Marcus issued a second rescript, directing that those who denied should be set free, and those who confessed beaten to death. It is clear that the first rescript placed the Christians in a more unfavorable position than that which they had occupied under the rescript of Trajan, for it gave provincial governors a warrant to hunt down the illegal sects to which I applied, whereas Trajan had expressly withheld such a warrant. On their part, meanwhile, the Christians made some attempts to protect themselves by repelling the charges which were popularly brought against them. An apologetic Christian literature, seeking to remove the prevailing prejudices, came into being, and is a feature of the 2nd century. A certain Aristides addressed a defense of Christianity to Antoninus, and this apology, which was supposed to have been lost, lies been lately recovered. But the most celebrated apologies are the two composed by Justin Martyr, a Samaritan born at Clavi, Neapolis. He had been trained in his youth in Greek philosophies, and thought that he had found in Platonism a satisfactory solution of the problems of existence. But one day at Ephesus he met an old man by the shore of the sea, who revealed to him the doctrines of Christianity. This led to his conversion. Encouraged perhaps by the tolerant spirit of Antoninus, he wrote about 148 A.D. an apology for the Christians, which he addressed to Antoninus, Marcus, who he calls Verissimus the philosopher, Lucius Verus the sacred senate, and the whole Roman people. He undertakes the defense of the men who are hated and reviled by the whole human race. He calls upon the emperor and his sons to listen to his pleas, and judge the cause fairly, if they would sustain their reputation of being pious philosophical guardians of justice and lovers of education. The treatise falls into 3 parts. In the first, the apologist points out that the Christians should not be condemned unheard, and shows that their conduct is innocent and harmless. They are good citizens. They render which are Caesar's, and pay their taxes regularly and punctually. In the second part, he professes to prove that the Christians alone teach the truth, that the Son of God was really made flesh, and that the pagan myths were invented by evil spirits, infectimus, in order that the coming of Christ might be rejected as fabulous. In the third part, the mysteries of baptism and the Eucharist, which the pagans were already disposed to regard with suspicion, are explained. The second apology, which appeared some years later, is a sort of appendix to the first. It is called forth by the execution of some Christians by the perfect Lollius Urbicus, to which reference has been already made. It has been supposed by some that these manifestations of Justin induced Antoninus to send his rescripts to the cities of the East for the prevention of persecution. Justin himself was destined to suffer martyrdom in 163 A.D. He was denounced at Rome by a philosopher named Crescens, and sentenced to death by the prefect of the city, Junius Rusticus, the Stoic. The first Latin apology for Christianity was the Octavius of Minucius Felix, which probably appeared in the reign of Marcus. Minucius does not appear to have been a Christian in the full sense of the word. He can hardly have believed in the divine nature of Christ, but he recognized that many of the Christian doctrines were true and acceptable, and tried to offer the religion to his pagan friends in a somewhat rationalized form. He was a sort of Christian Seneca. His work is in the form of a Ciceronian dialogue between Sacilius, who attacks the Christians, their works and their beliefs, and Octavius, who defends them. The scene of the conversation is laid on the seashore near Ostia. The Christians had not only enemies without to contend against, they had also heresies within. The three great Gnostic heresies of Basilius, Carpocrates, and Valentinus originated in the reigns of Hadrian and Antoninus. These men, all three of Oriental origin, propounded different theories to explain the creation of the world, the origin of evil, and the nature of the deity. These theories are medleys, combining doctrines taken from all sorts of philosophies and Oriental religions, as they illustrate the tendency of eclecticism, which has been already noted as a feature of age, but far the most powerful Gnostic sect, and that most dangerous to the Church, was founded by Marcion of Sinope, who came to Rome in the reign of Antoninus. It was known as Marcionism, and was characterized by exclusive adhesion to the writings of St. Paul, and by very vigorous asceticism. The effect of these heresies was to force the Church to define their teaching and explain their doctrines in writing. Thus persecution and heresy called into being an ecclesiastical literature, apologetical on the one hand, and polemical on the other. End of chapter 30, section 3. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota.